Hi everyone, I'm Cameron Moon. I'm the Assistant Curator of Historic Architectural Resources. And while we're all in quarantine today, I wanted to talk about a very relevant story about quarantine at Drayton Hall. Many of you have probably heard the story about why Drayton Hall wasn't burned during the Civil War, and that's that the owner at the time, Dr. John Drayton, placed quarantine flags at the entrance, signifying to Union soldiers that it was either a cholera or a smallpox hospital, so they didn't walk down to burn the plantation. But where does that theory come from? Is there any proof, or is it just a fun story that has been told for years? So from the socially distanced safety of my own home, I wanted to unpack where that theory comes from and bring you some primary sources. And this story I'll tell in two parts. The first part will unpack where this theory comes from, and part two, I'll talk about what we actually know. The smallpox and cholera hospital theory comes from two separate letters that we have in our files, and they come from private collections. So we have not actually seen the original copies of these letters. I haven't been able to track them down yet. We only have transcriptions of them, which is a problem because the transcriptions could be incorrect. One letter is from a farmer named John Amos, who may or may not have lived around Drayton Hall during the Civil War. He wrote this letter on March 1st to his friend who lived in Wilmington, North Carolina. And this was just 1 week after Union soldiers that we can confirm came through the area around Drayton Hall. And he wrote, "We are in terrible straits. The Yanks has burnt many farms. I worked for a farmer, but they ruined his land. I am one of too many folks who is looking for food and work. Many fine publican homes is burnt by them out of resent. A few have been saved because of the wiseness and cleverness of their owners. A Mr. Drayton, who has a very fine home, is said to have made himself a sick ward of his home. He knows that even Yanks are too scared to come near the fever. The Yanks are too afraid to burn a home of sick." The second letter was written by a woman named Clarissa Jones McGill. She was the daughter of a Charleston merchant, but she had been sent to North Carolina during the Civil War. So she wrote this letter from Charlotte, North Carolina, to her friend who was living in Virginia. She wrote this letter on February 28, 1865. This was only 5 days after the Union troops came through the area. And she wrote, "Charleston has fallen to the Yankees, and they are a most brutal kind of villain. They rob and abuse old folk and the lame men for mere spite. They have burned and plundered for want of celebration. A few men have fortunately saved their families much agony by outwitting some of the slovenly heathens. Messrs. J. Talbot and M. W. Harston invited Yankee officers to stay with them and thus drove off any vandals on the rage. Dr. J. Drayton posted his land as a cholera epidemic hospital and frightened away all of the wandering thugs. It is comforting that some of our treasured homes should be spared in the face of this manly brutality and war that men seem to like so much." So those are the two letters where this theory originates from. But what I wonder is, where did these people hear this story from? John Amos specifically said, "Mr. Drayton is said to have made himself a sick ward." And then Caroline Gilman lived in North Carolina. So it definitely implies that they heard this story from someone, but I've always wondered, where did they actually hear it from? To make matters more confusing, there is a third letter that completely throws a wrench in this quarantine story. This letter we've actually tracked down to the South Carolina Historical Society, so we have seen it, not just a transcription. It was written by a woman named Caroline Gilman, and she moved to Charleston in the early 1800s. She was originally from Boston, but she lived most of her life in the South. And throughout the Civil War, she wrote several letters to her family in different parts of the country. So this letter was written on August 5th, 1865. So this was several months after the Union troops had been through the area. And she wrote this letter from Greenville, South Carolina. So we're not sure where she was living during the time that the Union troops came through the area. She was probably not in Charleston, but she may not have been in Greenville either. And she wrote, Did you know that all of the residences on Ashley River were burned by the Northerners except Drayton Hall, which was used by them for a small post? So this completely throws a wrench in the smallpox and cholera hospital theory because she specifically says that Northerners used the house as a small post. However, her letter has been misquoted by people who have been researching this topic before as saying used by them for a small pox. So her letter has been used to bolster the smallpox theory when in fact it refutes it. That concludes part 1 of the origin of the quarantine story at Drayton Hall. We cannot confirm where John Amos, Clarissa Jones McGill, or Caroline Gilman heard these facts about Drayton Hall. All we know is we have only seen one real letter, not the transcription, and that is the one that refutes the story about the quarantine. In part 2, I will delve into the only first-hand account we have of what happened when Union soldiers went through the area around Drayton Hall in February of 1865. It comes from the diary of a surgeon who served with the 35th Regiment of the U.S. Colored Troops. So I'll see you soon for part 2.